Today, we're delighted to be joined by Dr. Joseph Lamb. Dr. Lamb is Assistant Professor of Religious Studies at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. He received his Ph.D. from the University of Chicago in 2012. His first book, Patterns of Sin in the Hebrew Bible, is the topic of our discussion today. Dr. Lamb, it's a pleasure to be speaking with you today.
It's good to be with you, Brian.
So, you mentioned in the beginning of the book, obviously this book began as your dissertation project for the University of Chicago. But how did you come to write on this topic specifically, and what about the research topic interests you?
Thank you for that question. So actually, if I were to really trace it back, go all the way back, I think the origins of this book can be found in my first year of graduate school for a course paper that I wrote for one of the Hebrew courses I did during my first year at Chicago. I'm sure we were reading some Hebrew texts where certain of this language dealing with sin came up. I can't remember what passage it was, but I wrote this paper on something that you might have questions about later. These phrases with the Hebrew verb nasa plus a verb for sin. Nasa is a verb that means to carry, but I wrote this paper trying to explain how these idioms worked, because in Hebrew, nasa can either mean to bear sin, like to bear its consequences, or to forgive it. So I wrote this paper trying to untangle the issues involved. And as is often the case, you start delving a little more deeply into an issue, and all manner of other issues arise. Different questions around metaphorical language, how that works in the Hebrew Bible, questions about what sin is in the Hebrew Bible, what we mean when we talk about sin. It was clear by the end of that paper. I submitted the paper, but it was clear that the confines of the course paper were nowhere near adequate to allow me to fully explore these questions. So the year after, I developed that into an MA thesis, basically just looking at the sin as burden metaphor, which became eventually, after much transformation, became one of the chapters in the book, and then later expanded it further to look at multiple metaphors, kind of all the major metaphors for sin in the Hebrew Bible. So I'll just add that I think one of the reasons that this topic has sustained my interest for this long is that it really is located at the intersection of a number of areas that are of interest to me. It involves questions of translation, how we translate Hebrew into English, and how that affects interpretation. It involves religious concepts. I have a lot of interest in kind of recovering how ancient Israelites imagine their world and their religious practices and beliefs. And also kind of various linguistic issues around semantics, how what words mean and how they mean what they mean, how language works. So it's just became a very fruitful topic of investigation that had kind of kept on giving, if you will. Yeah.
Yeah, and the book is completely surrounded on this concept of elucidating what the metaphors are and what they mean. And in your first chapter, you really dive into kind of the theoretical side of metaphors and kind of the ways that we can benefit from understanding words in metaphor. And one thing that you highlighted that I thought was really interesting was that a lot of scholars and teachers and even educated Bible readers are prone to view the etymology of a word as determining its meaning, especially when we're talking about abstract religious or theological concepts. But you approach it through metaphor. If you could you explain for a moment the benefit of the metaphor model over against other attempts to ascertain the meaning of these concepts?
Okay, yeah, sure. So I appreciate this question because it gets at one of the major interventions I'm trying to make with this book. So so let's kind of step back and think about what it is we're trying to do, and I try to articulate that in the book. So if our goal is to recover ancient religious concepts, like how ancient peoples imagine their world implicitly through their language. So obviously, if we had some ancient writer describing what sin was in 1,500 words, I mean that would be helpful in a certain way. We don't have that. Plus, that would also be kind of possibly idiosyncratic to that particular writer. So what I think a lot of scholars of language also try to do is, what can we discern about the culture, about shared conceptions embedded in the language? Now, if we're trying to do that, etymologies would seem on the surface to be a very promising avenue, right? I mean, so you can look at the history of a word. I mean, so an etymology is an explanation of how a word came to be, the origins of the word, the history of the word. So it's something you can do. You can do comparative Semitic linguistics and kind of figure out the histories of words and so forth. All that is important, and I'm not denigrating that at all. I do a lot of that work myself. But so on the surface, it seems promising. But when you think about it a little more, etymologies don't necessarily tell us a lot about how words are actually used. I don't know if you've ever had this experience. Actually, I'm sure most people who've ever opened a dictionary, an English dictionary, have had this experience where you come across a word in a dictionary that you know, but you see the etymology and you're like, oh, so that's what the etymology is. I never knew that, right? I mean, I never knew that's where the word came from. I've been using this word my whole life and I never knew the etymology. It's illuminating, but that's my point. You can go through life using words without knowing their etymologies. There's actually no, I think I'm speaking right now, I'm not thinking of the etymologies of the words I'm using. So kind of on the surface, kind of when we kind of think about it in that sense, etymologies are of limited use, right? We don't want to over rely on them. We certainly don't want to base our entire reconstruction of the ancient concept of sin, for instance, only on the basis of the etymologies of words for sin. And so that's kind of my critique. Now, the other approach, the metaphorical one that I offer, I'm not claiming that this is all one needs to do. There's a lot else that one could do to figure out what sin meant. But I think it's another promising avenue where and these metaphors that I'm talking about aren't the most poetic metaphors. They're not like the most original, unique metaphors that we would see in Shakespeare, for instance. Nor are they the totally tired, dead, completely dead metaphors like the foot of a mountain, right? Which is not really metaphorical anymore. But they're the metaphors in between. Metaphors that some theorists call conventionalized metaphors, which are part of the everyday language for speaking about a particular topic. But they're still, they're not that original. So one example might be the prevalence in American English of sports metaphors, especially in the business world. So we talk about, that business deal was a slam dunk. I mean, so the fact that people use metaphors like that all the time and people get it immediately tells us something about American culture, right? Relationship, business, and sports, and so forth. So one could, on the basis of these sorts of metaphors, discover something about shared cultural conceptions. So that's the kind of level of metaphor I'm trying to look at in the book. That level of, the sort of conventionalized ideas that exist around a particular topic, in this case, sin. And by looking at those rather than etymologies, which, again, were probably not at the forefront of any ancient Israelite speaker's mind, the business deal is a slam dunk kind of idea. I mean, that you kind of have to have some conscious idea of what a slam dunk is to use that phrase and to register that phrase. So it seems to be more reflective of how actual ancient speakers conceptualized certain ideas.
Yeah, that's helpful. In your first chapter, you dive into the metaphor of sin as burden, keeping along this idea of metaphor. And you kind of disambiguate the different usages, as you've already mentioned, of
Mhm.
nasa, which is a verb that can mean to lift up or to
Mhm.
forgive. And you speak about this process called lexicalization. Could
Mhm.
you clarify a bit for our audience what this means and how we see it kind of conceptualized in the metaphorical usages of nasa?
Okay. Yeah, so this takes a little bit of unpacking. We'll try to kind of do it piece by piece. So first, lexicalization, big long fancy word. All I mean is, um, by lexicalization, I mean the process by which a an etymology that's based in metaphor loses its metaphoricalness. So the way, um, thinking of metaphor as a possible way of generating new words. Or to put it another way, lexicalization is kind of the way a metaphor becomes frozen into the meaning of a word. So we could think of, I mean, lots of examples. I mean, think of the English word understand. Presumably, and at one point I looked this up in the Oxford English Dictionary. It meant to stand under something, right? Kind of as a
Sure.
sort of metaphor for what understanding means, or comprehending something. It's in Old English and so forth. Um, so so presumably it kind of has this metaphorical origin. But again, when we use the word understand, we're not thinking of that very physical idea at all. We just
Mm-hmm.
know what the word means. So that word's been lexical. We can say that the metaphor has been lexicalized. There are other cases that might be even more um, obviously lexicalization. I mean, in the case of understand, if I explain it to you, you can sort of recreate the metaphor in your mind, kind of by force. But there are other cases in English where, say, you have a Greek etymology, or etymologies in languages that the person speaking might not know. In which
Mm-hmm.
case, there's no possibility of even recovering it. So lexicalization can be in cases where, like, the speaker no longer has access to that original metaphorical origin, right? So
Mm-hmm.
historically it meant something metaphorical, but in its current usage, it's completely disconnected from that. Okay, so that's the idea of lexicalization. Then on to nasa. So nasa is this very common verb in Hebrew. Basically means to carry or to bear or to lift up. Essentially, it means to counter the force of gravity on an object is what nasa means, and it can have all these different English translations. Now,
Mm-hmm.
when it's used with sin, right, to nasa a sin, what's interesting, and all students of biblical Hebrew know this, it's got two seemingly divergent meanings. Sometimes it can mean to bear, usually one's own sin, like I'm carrying my own sin in the sense I'm guilty, I'm liable to punishment, all
Mm-hmm.
those ideas. But it can also mean to forgive sin. It's actually to lift sin off of someone else, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the question is, how do we make sense of these two seemingly divergent meanings? They both are used with sin as the thing being nasad. Um, so my explanation is kind of has two parts. The first part is to recognize that the forgive meaning is a lexicalized meaning, that it's basically a lexicalization of lifting off sin. So originally it's a metaphorical, to lift sin off of someone else. So say you sinned against me, I lift the sin off of you, meaning I forgive you. But that in its actual usages in biblical Hebrew that we find, and there are a number of them, it's no longer metaphorical. The metaphor is not being elaborated. Now, the second part of my explanation, so then the question arises: how do these two meanings relate to each other? Did one develop into the other, or is it based on context? To make a long story short, I think we have two distinct phases of biblical Hebrew that are being preserved in the biblical text. I mean, I think all scholars recognize the diversity, kind of that the Hebrew Bible, the texts of the Bible, were written over a long period of time. We have different uh, registers or phases of the ancient Hebrew language preserved together next to each other in various texts.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we essentially have two strands of biblical Hebrew, two diachronic phases, and that maybe counterintuitively, the forgive meaning, the lexicalized meaning, is kind of the meaning we find across most of biblical Hebrew. And
Mm-hmm.
that's actually earlier in the biblical text. And that later in the biblical text, we have one particular strand that revivifies the metaphor of sin as burden, um, to use it to talk about guilt and punishment and so forth. It's a bit of an involved argument, and I spend a lot of pages in the book kind of laying it out because there's a lot of scholarship that I discuss kind of from the last 100 years that have offered many different attempts to explain this. But I think it's got the two components: the lexicalization component for that one meaning, and then kind of these two different phases of the language.
Mm-hmm. Moving on to the next metaphor, because you have four metaphors in the book that you kind of go through. You
Hmm.
talk about the accounting of sin.
Hmm.
And this is a metaphor that's really familiar to the religious language of both Jews and Christians. Um, but where does this metaphor come from? You kind of talked about the origins of the Nasa metaphor. Where did this metaphor for accounting for sin come from? And what did it mean to the ancient Israelites?
Yeah. So by the accounting of sin, what I mean is a metaphor or a whole group of metaphorical expressions that are um, envisioned around the idea of sin being kind of a register of deeds being recorded on some text, with God, in the case of the Bible, God is a sort of heavenly record keeper. So God keeping records of sins, actually not only sins, but both good and bad deeds, and repaying them in proper measure. Now, this idea is sometimes conflated with or confused with the idea of sin as debt, like sin as a debt that you pay back. But I
Mm-hmm.
think that there's a distinction here that the idea throughout most of the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, is not so much as sin as a debt that the sinner repays, but it's which is a more economic type of metaphor. I think in the Bible, it's more rooted in the practices of ancient kings, right? So kings in the ancient world, in the ancient Near East, had a number of roles. They could be, rulership, obviously, sometimes a priestly role, but also a juridical role or a legal role, right? Issuing decrees, making decisions, being sort of the Supreme Court, right, of one person, right? So not like
Mm-hmm.
our country here where we have 9 people on the Supreme Court. In the ancient world, the king is the last person to go to appeal, right, for a final decision.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so in that juridical role, the king makes decisions, reckons good and bad deeds. So this manifests itself in the biblical text in a whole host of phrases. So sins are written down, they're erased, right? Sins are reckoned, they're remembered, they're called to mind, they're forgotten also. So if God forgets your sin, right, then it's like forgiving it, right?
Mm-hmm.
The consequences are no longer there. And sins are also paid back. So God pays back. So it's not the sinner paying back, but God paying back to the sinner in proper measure. Like if you sin badly, you'll be paid back in greater measure, but also paying back for good deeds as well. So it kind of this metaphor then structures a whole um, complex of biblical language around sin. It's actually one of the more important metaphors. So when I first kind of came to this project, the sin as burden metaphor is the one that's gotten all the attention, like within biblical scholarship. So there's a
Mm-hmm.
lot that's been written on that. Comparatively less, I mean, somewhat less. I wouldn't say nothing's been written on it, but only from certain angles. Um, this particular metaphor has not received as much attention, I think, in the literature, and so I try to kind of give it its due.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah.
And in what ways does this metaphor operate Obviously, you talked about diachronically with Nasa. How does this operate diachronically? Do we see it developing through the Hebrew Bible? And if
Yes.
to what
Yeah.
effect? Sorry.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. No. No. So, I mean, I just hinted at it. One of the most important diachronic distinctions is this account to debt,
Mm-hmm.
right? So, in later portions of the Hebrew Bible and into post-biblical literature, both Jewish and Christian literature, this sin as debt idea takes off. By
Mm-hmm.
sin as debt, I mean now that the sin is then envisioned. I mean, it may still at its root be a sort of deed, or a record, but the consequences then are dealt with more in the sense of the sinner having an initiative to pay back. So sin then incurs a debt, and the sinner then pays it back, does good deeds to pay it back. In fact, there's develops this idea of you get credit for good deeds
Mm-hmm.
to match up against the bad, and it's about kind of matching those ledgers.
Mm-hmm.
But so the metaphor develops in that sort of direction, um, which then I guess we could say it puts more responsibility on the part of the sinner, whereas in the Hebrew Bible, mostly it's the, the sinner is imagined more in a passive sort of position or state. There's not much said about what the sinner can do. I mean, sinner can turn away from their sin, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
But there's not a sense in which there's this kind of mathematical, economic sort of kind of ledger that you can counter the bad deeds by just doing more good in a mathematical sense. So,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, so there's kind of various kind of diachronic kind of issues involved there. Um, but as I say, yeah, it's a fairly pervasive metaphor within the biblical texts.
Well, and another pervasive metaphor that you talk about, and you even just kind of alluded to it in that answer,
Mm.
saying the sinner turning away, is
Mm,
you talk about the idea of sin as a path or direction, which is
right.
really common in the religious language, common to Jews and Christians. Um, but the word often translated as sin is Hatta,
Hmm.
which you discuss for some time. And a lot of people have mentioned it before as missing the mark, quote
Yeah.
unquote. So, um, how does this common understanding miss of hata and sin miss the mark?
Yeah, right. I like what you did there. Um, so hata is indeed the most common term for sin, and so kind of there's a few issues here. So I do, first of all, before getting into hata, I do want to say we have quite a number of developments of sin as path or direction metaphor. They use all different kinds of vocabulary aside from hata. Um, Now, hata happens to be the most common term for sin. It's chances are you open up the Old Testament, you see the word, like the verb to sin. It's translating the verb hata, um, and so here we get back to the etymology fallacy, the etymological fallacy that we talked about a little bit earlier, where it's supposed that hata, in its etymology means miss the mark, therefore to sin means to miss the mark. So while I wouldn't de-emphasize the importance of the sin as path or direction metaphor elsewhere, I don't think we really need to base it on the term hata. So again, there's a couple of issues involved. First, I think the metaphor is sometimes misconstrued. So even the etymology is misunderstood. So it's often thought of, okay, missing the mark means like you shoot an arrow and you miss, or you're like throwing a
Mm-hmm.
stone at a target and you miss. That's not the sense in which hata in its etymology means to miss. think a better way of understanding it is it means to fail to reach something. Part of this is the ambiguity in the English word miss, right? We use miss in terms of like I missed with an arrow, but we also, I could go to I'm meeting someone at the coffee shop, but I missed him, or right? Like us going somewhere and not finding what we were trying to find is also missing, right? In English, so I think there's a confusion there. Hatta only means the coffee shop type of miss, right? It's you're trying to get somewhere, but you're not finding what you were going to find. So it's failing to reach. It is a kind of more precise way of describing the etymology. With that said, Hatta is basically lexicalized. It doesn't really mean to fail to reach, right? If you were to look at its hundreds of, couple hundred occurrences in the Hebrew Bible, that idea is never really elaborated. In fact, there's an idiom with Hatta with a related term chet, which is the noun to sin. So you sin a sin, you Hatta a chet. You don't miss a miss, right? I mean, so there, Hatta chet means to commit a sin. So Hatta, the verb, basically has come to mean to sin, to commit a sin. It doesn't really have this spatial sense anymore. So, whereas while Hatta is a very common term, and while it does have this sort of spatial etymology, I wouldn't use it to support the idea of sin as path or direction necessarily. I think there's plenty of other evidence in the Bible for the development of that idea using different types of vocabulary. Yeah.
And thank you so much for being with us today. I just have one final question, kind of in keeping with the theme of metaphor. Some have stated that the Old Testament is dying in Christian teaching and preaching. So how would you suggest that we can reclaim the message and theology of the Old Testament for a contemporary Christian audience?
Yeah, interesting question. I mean, I guess all I would say is, and even some of my discussion hopefully has illustrated this, that a lot of ideas that, Christians would view as central theological ideas really just come from the Old Testament, comes from the language, of the Old Testament, biblical Hebrew, as much or more than the New Testament, right? There's some of the, if we're talking about sin, for instance, a lot of these ideas that I've been talking about now are probably very familiar, right, to listeners who are Christians. And I mean, that's sort of the basis, implicitly or explicitly, whether one recognizes it or not, of the ideas that are prevalent within theological discourse. So all I would say is it simply involves recognizing kind of where a lot of this language comes from, where a lot of the ideas that are within Christian theology come from, and they're rooted in biblical Hebrew, in the Hebrew scriptures, in this collection of texts that that kind of originates in ancient Israel and kind of this very particular historical context, but then kind of has this very rich, complicated subsequent history.
Well, thank you so much for this discussion today, Dr. Lamb.
Thank you. It's good being with you.